The courtroom was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustle of papers. It was just another ordinary day in a bustling city courthouse, a place where stories of struggle, conflict, and justice intertwined daily. People sat in the gallery, their faces a mix of boredom and tension, each waiting for their turn before the bench. A white-haired judge, known for his strict demeanor and unbending approach to the law, presided over the cases. His name was Judge Ronald Harrington, a man who had spent decades on the bench. To some, he was a symbol of order and authority. To others, he represented an unyielding system that often failed to see beyond the surface. On this day, his docket was long, filled with traffic violations, petty disputes, and misdemeanor charges. He moved through the cases swiftly, each judgment delivered with precision and finality. Then her name was called. Ms. Danielle Carter, the clerk announced. A woman rose from her seat and stepped forward. She was poised, confident, and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. Her presence commanded attention even in a room accustomed to routine appearances. But to Judge Harrington, she was just another defendant. Danielle Carter approached the stand, her expression calm but unreadable. She held her head high, her dark curls framing a face that exuded strength and composure. The judge glanced at her briefly, his eyes scanning the documents in front of him. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone clipped and businesslike, "you are here for a parking violation and failure to comply with municipal codes. How do you plead?" Danielle's voice was steady as she replied, "Not guilty, Your Honor." Judge Harrington barely looked up. "Not guilty. The evidence is clear. Your car was parked illegally, blocking a fire hydrant. Do you have any justification for this infraction?" The room seemed to hold its breath as Danielle paused. She glanced briefly at the audience, then back at the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice measured, "if I may, I'd like to explain the circumstances." But Judge Harrington cut her off with a dismissive wave. "This is a court of law, not a place for excuses. Do you have any evidence to refute the charges?" Danielle hesitated, her lips pressing together in a moment of quiet frustration. "I do, Your Honor," she replied, reaching into her bag. "I have proof that my car was parked legally, and the ticket was issued in error." The judge's expression hardened. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he stared down at her. "Miss Carter, this court does not have time for theatrics. Either present your evidence or accept the fine." The tension in the room was palpable. Danielle handed over a set of documents to the bailiff, who carried them to the bench. Judge Harrington scanned them quickly, his frown deepening. He looked up at her, his tone colder now. "This paperwork is irrelevant. The fine stands. That will be $250. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Danielle took a deep breath, her posture unwavering despite the obvious unfairness of the situation. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm, "I respectfully request that you review the details more carefully. I believe you'll find." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Enough, Miss Carter. You are wasting this court's time. Pay the fine or face further penalties." Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained composed. "Your Honor, I intend to appeal this decision." Judge Harrington smirked, a hint of condescension in his voice. "Good luck with that, Miss Carter. This court has little tolerance for baseless appeals." As Danielle turned to leave, a quiet yet undeniable tension filled the room. The judge had no idea who she really was. To him, she was just another black woman trying to argue her way out of a ticket. But Danielle Carter wasn't just anyone. She was a federal prosecutor, a skilled legal mind with a reputation for uncovering the truth and holding people accountable, even judges. Outside the courtroom, Danielle paused, her hands tightening around the strap of her bag. She wasn't angry. She was determined. This wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It was about principle, about justice, and about confronting a system that often judged people by appearances rather than facts. What Judge Harrington didn't realize was that the case he had just dismissed so carelessly was about to become a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone watching. Danielle walked down the courthouse steps, the faint sound of her heels clicking against the concrete. The city buzzed around her, a symphony of car horns, hurried footsteps, and snippets of conversations from strangers passing by. She was no stranger to the complexities of the legal system. In fact, she had spent her entire career navigating its labyrinthine corridors, ensuring that justice was served. But today had been different. Today, she had been judged not by her skills, her experience, or even her case, but by her appearance. The irony wasn't lost on her. As a federal prosecutor, Danielle had dedicated her life to upholding the law, defending those who had been wronged, and holding those in power accountable. She had faced off against some of the sharpest legal minds, dismantling elaborate schemes and uncovering corruption in places most people wouldn't dare to look. Yet here she was, treated as though her voice didn't matter, her evidence irrelevant. As she reached the street, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, dancing the screen. It was a text from her colleague Eric, a fellow prosecutor and one of her closest friends. Asterisk, how'd it go? Did they drop it? Asterisk. Danielle sighed and typed back, asterisk, not even close. He didn't look past the surface. Asterisk. The response came almost instantly. Asterisk, what happened? You okay? Asterisk. She hesitated before replying. She didn't want to let the day's events get to her. But there was no denying the sting of it. Asterisk. I'll tell you later. Headed back to the office now. Asterisk. Sliding her phone back into her bag, she flagged down a taxi and climbed in. As the car weaved through the busy streets, her mind wandered to the countless cases she had handled over the years. She thought about the people she had defended, the fights she had fought, and the victories she had celebrated. Each case had taught her something, shaped her into the person she was today. But this wasn't just about her. This was about a system that all too often dismissed people like her, people who didn't fit a certain mold. The taxi pulled up outside the federal building where Danielle worked. She stepped out, paid the driver, and walked through the large glass doors, nodding at the security guard on her way in. The familiar hum of the office greeted her as she stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for her floor. When the doors opened, Eric was already waiting for her, leaning casually against the wall. His sandy hair was slightly disheveled, and his tie hung loosely around his neck. "Okay," he said as she approached Spill. Danielle gave him a tired smile and gestured for him to follow her to her office. Once inside, she closed the door and leaned against her desk. "It's a long story," she began, recounting the morning's events in detail. Eric listened intently, his brow furrowing as she described Judge Harrington's dismissive attitude and the way he had shut her down. When she finished, he let out a low whistle. "That's unbelievable. He didn't even look at the evidence." She shook her head, barely glanced at it. He was more interested in rushing through the docket than actually listening to what I had to say. Eric leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "You know what this is, right?" Danielle nodded. "I know. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it won't be the last. That's why I can't let it go. I'm filing an appeal, not just for me, but for everyone who's been dismissed the same way." Eric grinned. "That's why I respect you, Carter. You don't back down, no matter what." She smiled faintly. "Thanks, but this isn't about respect. It's about doing what's right." As the day went on, Danielle threw herself into her work. But the morning's encounter lingered in the back of her mind. She began drafting her appeal during her lunch break, carefully outlining the facts and citing precedents that supported her case. The more she wrote, the more determined she became. This wasn't just a fight against an unjust fine. It was a stand against the broader issues she had seen too many times before. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Harrington sat in his chambers, reviewing case files. To him, Danielle Carter's case was already a distant memory, another file in a sea of paperwork. He prided himself on his efficiency, on his ability to move through cases quickly and decisively. But in his pursuit of speed, he often overlooked the nuances that could make all the difference. He didn't know that Danielle's appeal was already in motion, that the case he had dismissed so carelessly was about to become much larger than he could have imagined. The next morning, Danielle's appeal was filed, and word began to spread. In the legal community, whispers of the case reached the ears of colleagues, judges, and even journalists. Many were intrigued by the idea of a federal prosecutor challenging a judge's ruling in a seemingly minor case. But for those who knew Danielle, it wasn't surprising. Danielle Carter doesn't let things slide. One colleague remarked over coffee, "If she's fighting this, it's because it matters." As the days passed, the case began to draw attention beyond the courthouse walls. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a David and Goliath battle between a prosecutor and a judge. Social media lit up with debates about fairness, bias, and the legal system's treatment of marginalized groups. Danielle tried to ignore the growing buzz, focusing instead on her work and preparing for the appeal hearing. But she couldn't help noticing the emails and messages pouring in from strangers who resonated with her story. Some shared their own experiences of feeling dismissed or judged unfairly. Others simply offered words of encouragement. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from a young law student named Maya, who wrote, "Miss Carter, your story inspired me. I've always wanted to go into law to make a difference, but sometimes it feels impossible to change the system. Seeing you stand up like this gives me hope. Thank you. Danielle smiled as she read it, reminded once again why she had chosen this path. It wasn't about the accolades or the wins. It was about making a difference, even in the face of adversity. But not everyone saw it that way. In the shadows of the growing controversy, some critics began to emerge. Anonymous comments online questioned her motives, accusing her of seeking attention or trying to undermine the judiciary. Others dismissed her as overreacting, saying it was just a parking ticket. Danielle brushed off the negativity, knowing that the fight for justice was never without its detractors. Still, the scrutiny added another layer of tension to an already complex situation. As the date for the appeal hearing approached, the stakes continued to rise. Danielle knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about challenging a system that too often prioritized convenience over fairness, about standing up for those whose voices were ignored. In the quiet moments, as she prepared her arguments and reviewed her evidence, she thought about the countless people who had walked into courtrooms just like hers, hoping for justice and leaving with disappointment. She thought about the young law student who had written to her, about the colleagues who believed in her, and about the judge who had underestimated her. What Judge Harrington didn't realize was that his decision to dismiss her case so casually had set something in motion, something much larger than either of them. And as Danielle walked into the courthouse on the morning of the appeal, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet anticipation as Danielle entered, her presence commanding the same attention as before. This time, however, the stakes were higher, the atmosphere charged. Reporters lingered outside, their cameras clicking as she walked in. Inside, colleagues and strangers alike had gathered, drawn by the story of a prosecutor challenging the very system she worked within. Danielle carried herself with quiet confidence, but her mind was sharp and focused. She knew this wasn't just another hearing. Every detail mattered. Every word would be scrutinized, not only by Judge Harrington, but by the growing audience watching from the sidelines. Judge Harrington himself sat at the bench, his usual stern demeanor slightly more rigid than usual. The buzz surrounding the appeal had not escaped his notice, and though he'd never admit it, he felt a twinge of unease. This was no longer a routine case. It was a challenge to his authority, and more than that, a test of his fairness. As the proceedings began, Danielle stood to present her argument. Her voice was steady, measured, and precise, as she laid out the evidence that had been overlooked during the initial hearing. She spoke about the circumstances of her parking, the errors in the ticketing process, and the legal precedents that supported her appeal. But it wasn't just about the parking violation anymore. "Your Honor," she said, her gaze unwavering, "this case is about more than a simple fine. It's about the fundamental principles of fairness and justice. It's about ensuring that everyone who steps into this courtroom is treated with the same respect and given the same opportunity to present their case, regardless of how they look or what assumptions might be made about them. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. Judge Harrington shifted slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable. Danielle's words struck a chord, not just with those in the gallery, but with him as well. He wasn't used to being challenged so directly, and it unsettled him. As Danielle continued, she noticed a familiar face in the back of the room. Maya, the law student who had written to her. She gave the young woman a small, encouraging nod before returning to her argument. Maya's presence reminded her why she was doing this, why it mattered. Meanwhile, Eric sat among the spectators, watching the proceedings with a mix of pride and concern. He knew Danielle was more than capable, but he also understood the risks she was taking. Going up against a judge wasn't just about winning a case. It could have lasting consequences for her career and reputation. As Danielle finished her statement, the judge motioned for the opposing side to respond. The city attorney, who had been called in to defend the original ruling, stood and began his rebuttal. His arguments were technical, focused on procedural points and the validity of a ticket. But they lacked the passion and clarity of Danielle's words. As the arguments unfolded, a subtle tension grew in the room. It wasn't just about the facts anymore. It was about the larger questions Danielle had raised, questions about fairness, bias, and the way the system treated those who didn't fit its mold. Outside the courtroom, the story was gaining traction. News outlets framed it as a clash between a seasoned judge and a prosecutor fighting for justice. Social media was ablaze with debates, hashtags like #Justice for Danielle and #Equality in Court trending as people weighed in on the case. Some saw Danielle as a hero, a beacon of hope for those who had felt silenced or dismissed by the system. Others criticized her, accusing her of grandstanding or using her position to make a point. The divide was stark, but it only fueled the intensity of the conflict. Behind the scenes, Judge Harrington was grappling with his own doubts. He reviewed the case files late into the night, the weight of the scrutiny pressing heavily on him. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning his approach, wondering if he had been too quick to dismiss Danielle's arguments during the initial hearing. At the same time, Danielle's resolve was tested. She received messages of support, but also criticism and even veiled threats from anonymous sources. She leaned on Eric and her small circle of trusted colleagues, but the pressure was undeniable. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was personal, a fight for her integrity and for the principles she believed in. As the hearing stretched on, new layers of the conflict began to emerge. Reporters uncovered details about Judge Harrington's record, pointing out patterns in his rulings that suggested a bias against certain groups. Advocates for judicial reform seized on the story, using it as a rallying cry for change. But Danielle didn't let the noise distract her. She focused on the case, on the evidence, and on the message she wanted to send. This wasn't about tearing anyone down. It was about building something better, about showing that even the smallest cases could have a ripple effect if handled with care and fairness. The tension reached a peak as Danielle called her final witness, a traffic officer who had issued the original ticket. Her questioning was precise, uncovering inconsistencies in the officer's accounts and highlighting the procedural errors that had led to the fine. By the time the hearing concluded, the room was electric with anticipation. Judge Harrington announced that he would take the case under advisement and issue a ruling in the coming days. As Danielle left the courtroom, the reporters swarmed her, microphones and cameras thrust in her direction. She paused briefly, her expression calm but resolute. "I trust the legal system to do what's right," she said simply before walking away. That evening, as Danielle sat in her apartment, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. She thought about the people who had supported her, about the obstacles she had faced, and about the road ahead. The fight wasn't over, but she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't back down. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Harrington sat alone, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, a sense of vulnerability, a recognition that perhaps he hadn't been as impartial as he had always believed. The city held its breath, waiting to see how the story would unfold, how the conflict between these two determined individuals would shape the conversation about justice and equality. One thing was certain: whatever happened next, it wouldn't just be about a parking ticket. It would be about much more than that. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and speculation. Danielle's case had become a lightning rod for debates about fairness in the justice system, and every corner of the city seemed to be buzzing with opinions. News anchors dissected every argument from the hearing, while social media erupted with commentary, ranging from fiery support for Danielle to sharp criticism of her motives. The city had been consumed by a story that started with a parking ticket, but had grown into something far more profound. Judge Harrington, meanwhile, found himself in an unfamiliar position. His typically unshakable confidence had been replaced by an incessant hum of doubt. He pored over the case files in his chambers late into the night, rereading Danielle's arguments and the testimony she presented. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something about his original ruling had been too hasty, too dismissive. For a man who had spent decades on the bench, this self-reflection was both unsettling and deeply personal. Danielle, on the other hand, prepared herself for what she knew would be a defining moment in her career. The stakes were no longer confined to the courtroom. This was about setting an example, about proving that fairness and justice weren't just lofty ideals, but tangible goals that could be pursued even in the face of adversity. She spent her nights reviewing case law, meticulously crafting her closing remarks, knowing they would have to strike a balance between passion and precision. But as focused as she was, Danielle couldn't escape the external pressures bearing down on her. She received countless messages, some encouraging, others hateful. Her resolve was tested each time she opened her email or glanced at her phone. Yet through it all, she kept reminding herself why she had taken this stand. It wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had ever felt silenced or dismissed by a system that was supposed to protect them. Meanwhile, Eric stood by her side, offering quiet support. He could see the toll the case was taking on her, but he also knew how determined she was. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, he reached out and took her hand. "You're doing something important," he said softly. "No matter how this ends, you've already made a difference." His words were a balm for Danielle's very spirit, but they also reminded her of the enormity of what she was up against. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It had become a fight for the soul of the justice system, a fight to ensure that every voice could be heard. The city attorney, sensing the mounting public interest in the case, doubled down on his efforts. His team scoured Danielle's arguments for any weaknesses, determined to uphold the original ruling and discredit her claims. To him, this wasn't just about the specifics of a parking violation. It was about defending the integrity of the system and protecting his reputation. As the day of the final hearing approached, the tension reached a fever pitch. The courthouse became a hub of activity, with reporters camped outside, eager for any scrap of information. Inside, the staff whispered about the case, their usual routines disrupted by the unprecedented attention. Even those who had no direct involvement found themselves drawn into the drama, wondering how it would all unfold. On the morning of the hearing, Danielle woke up early, her mind racing with anticipation. She dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that conveyed both professionalism and strength. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. The courthouse was packed when she arrived, the gallery filled to capacity with journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. Danielle could feel the weight of their eyes on her as she walked to her seat, her head held high. She spotted Maya in the crowd, her young protege's expression a mix of admiration and nervous energy. Seeing her gave Danielle a renewed sense of purpose. Judge Harrington entered the courtroom, his presence commanding silence. He looked out at the crowded gallery, his expression impassive, but his mind anything but. He had spent sleepless nights wrestling with the complexities of the case, and now the moment of truth had arrived. As the proceedings began, Danielle delivered her closing argument with unwavering conviction. She spoke not just as a prosecutor, but as someone who believed deeply in the ideals of justice and equality. Her words resonated with the audience, drawing nods of agreement from some and quiet murmurs from others. She didn't just argue the facts of the case, she painted a picture of what justice could look like if everyone was treated with dignity and respect. When she finished, the courtroom was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Even the city attorney seemed momentarily taken aback, though he quickly recovered and launched into his rebuttal. His arguments were sharp and pointed, but they lacked the emotional resonance of Danielle's. It was clear he was fighting not just to win the case, but to preserve the status quo. As the two sides presented their final points, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Every glance, every gesture seemed charged with meaning. The stakes were clear to everyone present. This was about more than just a parking ticket. It was about the values that underpinned the justice system and the kind of society people wanted to build. When the arguments concluded, Judge Harrington announced that he would take the matter under advisement and issue his ruling within the week. The gallery erupted into murmurs as people began speculating about what his decision might be. But Danielle remained composed, her face betraying no hint of the turmoil she felt inside. As she left the courthouse that day, Danielle was surrounded by reporters, their questions flying fast and furious. "Do you think you've done enough to win the case?" one of them asked. "What message are you trying to send with this appeal?" Another inquired. Danielle paused for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "This case is about more than just me," she said. "It's about ensuring that everyone, no matter who they are, has a fair chance to be heard. That's what justice is supposed to be about." Her words were quickly picked up by the media, adding fuel to the already raging fire of public interest. As the city waited for the judge's ruling, the tension continued to build, the question on everyone's mind. How would it all end? The courthouse settled into an uneasy quiet as the days passed, the weight of Judge Harrington's decision looming large over the city. Conversations in coffee shops, offices, and even neighborhood parks circled back to the same question. What would the ruling mean for Danielle, for Judge Harrington, and for the justice system itself? The story had taken on a life of its own, pulling in people who had never set foot in a courtroom, but who now felt personally invested in the outcome. Danielle tried to focus on her work, burying herself in her caseload to keep from overthinking. Yet, no matter how busy she stayed, the anticipation gnawed at her. Eric could see the toll it was taking on her, and trying to help her find small moments of calm. A walk in the park, dinner at her favorite restaurant. But the tension was always there, a shadow that refused to lift. Then, just days before Judge Harrington was expected to deliver his ruling, a new development shook the case to its core. A reporter, digging through public records for a deeper angle, uncovered a series of emails sent from Judge Harrington's office to the city attorney's team during the original proceedings. While the content wasn't overtly incriminating, the tone and timing raised serious questions about impartiality. The email suggested that the judge had discussed procedural shortcuts with the city attorney's team, giving them subtle advice on how to frame their arguments against Danielle. The revelations hit like a thunderclap, spreading across social media and dominating the news cycle. Accusations of judicial bias flew fast and furious, with many calling for an independent review of the judge's conduct. Danielle first heard the news from Maya, who called her late one evening, her voice trembling with excitement and disbelief. "Have you seen the headlines?" Maya asked. "This changes everything." But Danielle didn't share her enthusiasm. While the revelations added a new layer to her case, they also risked overshadowing her carefully crafted arguments. She didn't want the focus to shift from the principles she was fighting for to a sensationalized scandal. The next morning, Danielle stood in her office, staring at her reflection in the window as she thought about her next move. The easy choice would be to use the emails to bolster her case, to point to them as proof that the system was flawed. But something about that felt wrong. This wasn't how she wanted to win. Her battle had always been about fairness and equality, not about tearing someone else down, even if that someone was a judge who has shown questionable judgment. At the same time, the revelation added another layer of pressure for Judge Harrington. His previously unshakable reputation was now under intense scrutiny, and he couldn't escape the whispers that followed him through the halls of the courthouse. For the first time, he found himself questioning not just his decisions in Danielle's case, but his broader approach to the bench. Had he allowed personal biases to seep into his rulings? Had he, in his quest for efficiency, compromised the fairness he had sworn to uphold? As the city watched the fallout, another twist emerged. The city attorney, sensing that the emails could potentially derail his case, reached out to Danielle with an offer. In a move that stunned even his own team, he proposed a settlement. If Danielle agreed to drop her appeal, the city would void her parking fine and issue a public apology for any procedural missteps. Eric, ever the pragmatist, urged her to consider the offer. "It's a win," he told her one evening as they sat in their living room. "You could walk away with your record clear and your point made. Isn't that what you wanted?" But Danielle couldn't shake the feeling that accepting the settlement would mean giving up on something bigger. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been dismissed or underestimated, everyone who had felt the sting of injustice. If she walked away now, what message would that send? As she weighed her options, Danielle received an unexpected visitor at her office. It was Judge Harrington, his usual air of authority tempered by an unfamiliar vulnerability. He asked to speak with her privately, and though she was caught off guard, she agreed. Sitting across from her in the modest conference room, Harrington looked every bit the seasoned judge, but his eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "Miss Taylor," he began, his voice steady but quieter than she had ever heard it. "I wanted to speak with you directly before this goes any further." Danielle listened, her expression unreadable, as Harrington explained his perspective. He didn't deny the emails or their implications, but he framed them as an attempt to ensure efficiency in a case he had considered minor at the time. "It was never my intention to undermine your rights or dismiss your arguments," he said, his tone almost pleading. "But I see now how it might appear, and I regret that." His words left Danielle conflicted. On the one hand, his acknowledgement felt like a step toward accountability. On the other, it raised more questions than it answered. Was he genuinely remorseful, or was this an attempt to salvage his reputation in the face of mounting public scrutiny? As their conversation ended, Danielle was left with more questions than answers. The settlement offer, the emails, and now Harrington's unexpected visit all swirled in her mind, each adding a new layer of complexity to an already tangled situation. Outside, the city buzzed with anticipation. The courthouse had become a symbol of the broader fight for justice, drawing protesters, activists, and curious onlookers. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for All" and "Accountability Now" lined the steps, their messages a reflection of the growing divide over what this case represented. As the day of the ruling approached, Danielle felt the weight of the moment more acutely than ever. This wasn't just about her fight anymore. It had become a turning point, a moment that could either reinforce the status quo or challenge it in ways that few had dared to before. In the quiet moments before the ruling, as she sat alone in her office, Danielle allowed herself a rare moment of doubt. Was she ready for what was to come? Could she handle the fallout, whatever it might be? And most importantly, was the fight worth the cost? Deep down, she already knew the answer. The stakes were too high to walk away now. But as she prepared to step back into the courtroom, one thing was clear: the conflict was far from over. If anything, it had just reached its most critical point.